She was one of those people who could flush and blush to cue. And she walked back into the back of the studio against the bar and then stepped out and held this fabric over her head. You could see it like a veil. And it looked like all the lights went out. And she turned pink. And I thought, I don't believe this, you know.
She was so present, so there, and she was almost vibrating. I mean, she wasn't vibrating, but it was almost seemed as if she was. And she I felt as if when I got close to her, that, I was being just sucked right into her world.
And she did this by finding a way to be vulnerable, almost empty the body so that it was possible to pull somebody in with you.
And I remember when I was the victim, when Martha would take the dress and pour over it and burn the victim, she was really hot. I felt the heat coming from her.
She was able to create a quality that you felt very strongly, a smell, a taste, a way of moving that you felt very strongly. And it would be hard to make a false movement in front of her because of that.
She was the one that moved you to move that way because you weren't imitating anything, you weren't exploiting anything, you were fulfilling something.
She had a real gift at putting her finger on the innards of a feeling, and she was not afraid of dealing with those dark things in herself and in people.
The point is this, with Martha's repertoire, and one of its attributes that makes it great is that every dance is another world. Every dance involves another human experience, and they're very different from each other.
The work of Martha Graham left an indelible imprint on the minds and bodies of countless dancers and on the evolution of modern dance. Graham's legacy is breathtaking, complex, and fragile. The Library of Congress has embarked upon an extensive preservation and documentation project to ensure that Graham's contribution to our cultural heritage is preserved for future generations. In 1999, the Martha Graham Collection was established at the Library of Congress, and documentation began in an effort to reveal the essential elements that underpin Graham's genius. In November 1999, the Martha Graham Dance Company performed at the Library of Congress Coolidge Auditorium, where in 1944, Appalachian Spring was premiered.
In Appalachian Spring, what she did with Merce was so wonderful as a preacher, because we were the little followers and we always adored him, you see, and it was quite beautiful what she did with that. It was very sensitive and delicate what she did. That was an interesting time because it was the Library of Congress, and there was Appalachian Spring, and there was Herodiad with May, Martha and May.
There was a signal of some kind that turned me around, then the rush to Martha and her feet. And then I knew what I was in the piece. And I could feel Martha. I could feel how she was herself trying to build strength. And all I could do was give it to her, not only in caressing her feet, but giving it to her with my spirit.
One of the essential elements of Graham's legacy is the emphasis on characterization. Former company members coached the young dancers to help them define their roles.
She made a great deal of the word husbandman, which if you look up in the dictionary means farmer. But she made a broader meaning. To husband something is to care for, to nurture it. That's the kind of guy he is. He doesn't have to do anything. It's the strength in him. When he wants it, it's there. And you've got to know that. It's in you. You're strong. And so he doesn't have to pump up.
I was, I guess, trying to present too much. I was trying to...
And she thought of him as a caring, nurturing person. Wonderful thing Martha did. The shaking of the hands. But when they shake hands, as Martha said, each one is saying, I am stronger. I could throw you if I wanted. It's gotta be there.
This is the most interior that she gets, and she still has that driving focus. But it's like, you know, when somebody's really concentrating on something.
Martha told me that there's a big difference between Appalachian Spring and Frontier, although people confuse the two. She said Frontier was a dance of exploration, while Appalachian Spring was a dance of settlement. One of the things that even today startles people is when she rolls down the stairs, and that's one of her metaphors for an emotional state.
This dance is all about question and am I doing the right thing? Martha talks about internal landscape. This is the dance about the internal landscape. It gets hot and cold, hot and cold. Question, question. It's a sense of agitation for me. That's my interpretation. Martha never tells us all these things.
Further down before you...
Graham insisted that dancers develop their own internal landscape to enrich the roles. And she developed a technique and vocabulary that enabled the body to become a vehicle for expression.
In the case of the preacher, the revivalist, there is the threat of doom. There is this sense of the ominous, and the preacher then changes his body to evoke this sense of horror of fire and brimstone that is awaiting this couple.
This is God's wrath, the rain will come upon you, and fire and brimstone will hail down on you, and it's down, you know, clouds will open up and bring down hell.
Preacher is coming down to invite you to be with him, and he's going to teach you something about the Bible, perhaps. All right? Now, you don't get that kind of occasion very often. So your heart is going tap, 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 tap.
Up. She had a great intuitive sense of what to do within what was happening musically, instead of the music imitating or illustrating what she did. She worked the most organic way of all.
So sometimes you could be behind the beat, too. You don't have to be on the beat. Behind the beat. Behind the beat.
You did movements that were sharp. There were contractions where you took a contraction and landed on one foot, balanced, with the other one in the air. And they were brittle and sharp, like the sounds you heard in the street.
Yeah.
You know, that the kind of movements that she was doing belonged in the city.
Another essential element is Graham's use of imagery, verbal descriptions which conveyed feelings to the dancers, and to actors she taught at the neighborhood playhouse.
But it was very interesting that some people who'd been tied in knots and were very embarrassed by anything they had to do physically. The person really emerged through movement.
She used to do this at Juilliard a lot anyway, when she would have people say, one, and it wasn't from a deep enough place, you know, it would be too much one up here, and then finally it would get deeper and deeper from underneath him, a real one, you know, which was,
made the contraction, exhale.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The important thing is to put the brakes on as you come around to the front, and whether it's a fist or evoking, spewing forth. It's almost speaking in tongues by now, but it's as you come around, you have to stop the contraction to the front each time.
When Martha taught, she would always give one some insight into a deeper way to do the movement, even though you'd been doing it
over and over. Still, what happened in the attack and what you felt in straightening the leg was always some fresh little twist that she would introduce that would give you a way of doing it with more use of your body, with more intensity. And you knew you had to find something that would feed you so that you could do the movement and justify it.
She did use images. If you think of a cat, and she used that image a lot of a lion pacing, so that the cat is on the ground, and because it's so on the ground, it can actually be very soft and padded in its movement because it's using gravity. It's using the weight on the floor. It can also, because it's doing that, spring very high. You relate your physical body to an animal state and come up through that to the human state. And I think it gives an added dimension to what movement is all about.
Throughout her life, Graham continued to evolve as an artist, and those changes were reflected in her technique and choreography.
Just as I entered the company and the classes in 1946, we were still doing the kind of old percussive technique. And by 1947, which is just a year later, the technique has started to change and move and become more spiraled, more lyric, more freer. And I think that Diversion of Angels had a lot to do with that.
She was exploring a movement off-center. She had said in a rehearsal, I don't want a floor under these dancers now. I want it to look like a Chagall. People emerge from space, not from the floor. You pull up so high in the center, and when there is no more lift, you go off into space on the side, and it's as though you're being pulled into the air.
It's a balance with movement.
With movement.
And then you would catch that tilt into a contraction.
Yes, and you needed that stretch so that the contraction gave it the dark pull, the opposite.
Perhaps we could look at some footage. This is a version of Angels done for the Metropolitan Opera's 100th birthday gala. And we'll just look at the entrance of the girl in red as she comes in before the duet. And of course, you see this characteristic tilt. You feel free to say anything you like.
I tilted so that I ended right on her knee, so that there was a contact there rather than just a single.
So you actually touched and were in front of her. And was the tilt the same? I mean, or was the torso further over?
The torso was further over and the leg wasn't quite so high. So that it, Martha always said you were upside down in love.
All of the timing was always pulled away from perfection. A lift would happen a fraction of a second later or sooner, or it would change, or we would both start something, but not exactly together.
And I didn't have the same kind of timing that the men, because they have real deep elevation, and mine was more pounce.
Right, just spring right up out of the floor.
The ensemble pounced into the contraction. And I always thought of it as a somersault.
Do the next one. I think it's the kind of thing that if a dancer gets the concept, they'll have to make it up out of the same moves, but it will be very personal to them too.
Martha Graham's legacy continues to inspire us through the dances, technique, and memories she left behind.
Even after Martha's death, a great number of dancers and a great number of audience have been drawn to Martha's work. It touches such a universal core in every human being that it can't be denied. People feel it.
With Martha, her life was her work. The work was her life. The technique was her life. The technique was her work. The dances were her life. The dances were her. There was nothing else. It was all one package. And that's the way it was every day, all the time.